All right, welcome everyone. Today, in this edition of Rockefeller College's election series, we are going to be talking about civil disobedience and matters related to activism more generally. We are joined by two professors from Rockefeller College. We're joined by Matthew Ingram. He is a professor at UAlbany and currently the interim senior executive director of the School of Criminal Justice. His research focuses on the politics of subnational court reform in Latin America, particularly in Brazil and Mexico. We're also joined by Dr. Meredith Weiss. She's also a professor at UAlbany and founding director of the SUNY CUNY Southeast Asia Consortium. Her research focuses on protest and student activism in Malaysia in particular, and Southeast Asia generally speaking. Before I hand it over, I think we'll have Dr. Ingram speaking first. Before I hand it over, just laying out some ground rules here. If at any point in today's talks, you have a question, please just put it in the chat and I'll read it to our panelists once they're finished speaking. Alternatively, as always, you can use the hand raise function and I'll be monitoring that throughout the talks and I will call on you. That being said, I'll pass it over to Dr. Ingram.
Thank you, Connor. Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you today. I'm going to cover some basic rights or legal issues connected to civil disobedience, and we'll talk for maybe about 10 minutes, and then we'll pass it on to my colleague, Professor Weiss. I do want to open by saying that nothing that I say is legal advice. I went to law school, but I am an academic, not a lawyer. So if anybody needs specific legal advice, please find a lawyer. That said, I'll cover two main topics, some considerations if exercising First Amendment rights on campus, and then the connection of the exercise of these rights to civil disobedience. And hopefully what I say on the second point will dovetail nicely with what Professor Weiss has to say. I'll try to keep my comments relevant to the university setting, specifically a public university like UAlbany. With regards to considerations related to exercising First Amendment rights on campus, the First Amendment does protect your ability to express your opinions on a college campus. This is especially important even if others disagree with the content of your opinions or the way you choose to express them. It also covers behavior beyond just spoken or written words. I'll come back to this later when we talk about civil disobedience. So some of that behavior might include boycotts, sit-ins, protests, or marches. Yet institutions like UAlbany can still set rules that are reasonable about the time, place, or manner of expression. For instance, the classroom is a designated forum for specific types of exchange. Individual expression is welcome, but this expression can't be disruptive or derail the purpose of the classroom and the educational mission of the group that's there. A speech that might be okay by an outdoor fountain or out in the quad might not be okay in a library because it is disruptive for similar reasons. It can't be unsafe or disruptive in other ways. That is, speech can't be unsafe or disruptive in other ways, like blocking hallways or entrances or exits to buildings. And it can't be threatening or violent. It may be a little bit more a little bit less visible or less common way of thinking about it. It can't violate the code of conduct. Even if it violates the code of conduct and discipline ensues, due process is still required. So this means that a notice of a disciplinary proceeding must take place, and say the student who is the target of that discipline would have a right to hear or know about evidence for that discipline, including witnesses. The student would have an opportunity to defend themselves and would also have the right to know the final results. And there's no requirement, but a campus could choose to provide a defense. But again, this is not required. and the campus is not required to allow a legal representative of the students choosing or allow cross-examination, right, questioning of witnesses, or even to record the hearing or other proceeding. There are also privacy implications at work. We might be concerned about whether others, for instance, an employer outside of campus, might find out about your activities on campus. Schools cannot share information about your education or activities on campus, but things that fall under what's called directory information are shareable, right? Just your name, maybe your major, or what team or extracurricular activity you might be involved in. So if you're concerned about that kind of information becoming known, then that's something to consider. Also, what others may share via social media or other sources not controlled by the university. So it's also good to be aware that activities on campus could become known to others off campus. And then off-campus activity, if there is First Amendment speech or expression or other conduct taking place off campus, codes of conduct from campus do generally extend to off-campus expression if it can be shown that that expression is disruptive to the school. There's an important recent Supreme Court case on this topic about a high school student in 2017 who didn't get promoted from a junior varsity cheer squad to a varsity cheer squad, and away from school with her friends recorded a brief Snapchat video, right, giving the middle finger to the school and dropping several F-bombs about the school and cheer and another sport. But the court found that this was not disruptive of the school, right, by an 8-1 vote, that there wasn't a sufficient connection. The student never mentioned the school, never mentioned any individuals, any teachers. It wasn't threatening of any one staff or coach or teacher. And so the school ruled that this was okay. This was supportive of a decision back in the 60s of students wearing black armbands to school in protest of the Vietnam War. Again, that wasn't sufficiently disruptive. Yet we can imagine situations that might be different, right? If a student were to give a speech off campus that encouraged other students to return to campus and engage in blocking entrances or in something that would be more disruptive of classroom activities. So what does this have to do with civil disobedience? Civil disobedience, a few of the attributes of civil disobedience are that one is deliberately choosing to break the law. The purpose of breaking that law is to draw attention to a clear, substantial injustice, and ideally, perhaps that the participants tried to address this injustice in another way. That is, they tried maybe to use their speech as a form of persuasion prior to choosing to break the law. But it's also nonviolent, and there's a willingness on the part of the participants to accept the consequences of breaking the law without maybe upending the whole legal system. So we have a lot of textbook cases of civil disobedience along these lines, Thoreau, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, where there's an unjust law that's the target of civil disobedience, and the purpose of breaking the law is to convey a message to a larger audience. And then that message is reinforced when authorities arrive to enforce the law. It's worth noting that successful civil disobedience movements work in close coordination with authorities frequently. It's choreographed and orchestrated in a certain way by people who do this well. So again, bringing this back to UAlbany, it might be worth considering what this means as we work through some of these points and expand on the legal implications. Presumably, if there is civil disobedience on campus, there is some prior speech that was already previously attempted as a form of persuasion. Maybe even there's an effort to coordinate with authorities like UPD to more closely choreograph or orchestrate the activity to be more successful. Most importantly, there's a deliberate effort to break a law to convey a message. So this necessitates, or this requires some work to identify which law to break, how that conveys the message, whether that's the best way to convey the message, especially if there are arrests, right? So is the code of conduct going to be violated or some other law? And then what message is conveyed by this law? How does this draw attention to your cause or advance your goals? From the 1960s to the 1980s, there was a big movement to divest universities' endowments from South Africa. So that's one example. Current issues of divestment include climate change or the gun industry, and even Israel. Brown University has an ongoing effort to encourage the university to divest its endowment from companies based in Israel. But more questions arise. It's unclear that divestment works. The goal is to reduce the share price of companies from a particular sector or country. Yet research shows that these prices remain fairly stable over time. And also it takes time for this effect, if any, to take place. Even to divest in this way takes time due to legal barriers related to moving investments around. It needs to be nonviolent. Whatever civil disobedience takes place needs to be nonviolent. So the activities can't involve threats or incitements to violence. But there can be unintended consequences, and we saw this at UCLA earlier this year, and then again just yesterday or 2 days ago. Initial protests were peaceful, but then counter protesters attacked the encampment and violence ensued. In addition, there must be a willingness to accept consequences. Again, because civil disobedience involves deliberately breaking the law. Back to UCLA, there was a large encampment of some 200 people, right, that then was attacked. But even if the encampment had not been attacked, right, assuming that they had not been attacked and it had remained peaceful, the participants should have been willing to presumably accept the consequences of breaking a law if it was disruptive to the movement of people, or if there were some alleged law breaking or violation of a code of conduct. If not willing to accept the consequences of breaking the law this way, then a key piece of civil disobedience is missing. And then if there are consequences like an arrest, the participants again should have anticipated this, and this is important for two reasons. One, you might want to reconsider speech in the circumstances of an arrest, because the First Amendment has important limitations once you have broken the law and committed a crime. Now what you say can be used against you. So it's important to consider not speaking, remaining silent. Indeed, the best thing to do from my perspective is simply to ask for an attorney. And then if you're anticipating that you might be arrested, it's important to anticipate how you might more easily avoid going to jail. And one of the most important things might be to prepare for that and bring, among other things, an ID, right? So that you can be easily and readily identified and avoid being incarcerated. There's some other things that I could say, but I'll stop there and I'll just return to my main points. I am not an attorney. This is not legal advice. So if you're looking for specific advice, find an attorney. And then participants who are engaged in civil disobedience on campus should think about the message that is the goal of the activity, what audience you're trying to reach, and be prepared to accept the consequences of breaking the law. Most people don't experience consequences as a result of civil disobedience, right? At least in the US, in the campus setting. But if you engage in civil disobedience, you should be prepared for those consequences. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and start. So I am even farther from an attorney. I didn't go to law school. I don't focus on the US at all. So definitely don't take any of this in that light. And I'll also try to edit on the fly a bit so I'm not repeating things that Prof. Ingram just said. But so I come at this topic from the perspective of somebody who, among other things, studies activism of various forms outside the US. And a bit, just the literature is sometimes on the US, but my own research is wholly in Asia. So I'll give a somewhat different perspective, which is less of a practical guide of what are the rules and how to and what to expect, but more how we should frame this sort of politics. So broadly speaking, the term civil disobedience in common parlance may convey something illicit or illegal, that's inherent in the name. But in practice, the term tends to extend from protest actions wholly within established rules to actions that are designed to flout and thus undercut those rules. So to say, for instance, that something is disobedient means that it is against some rule, but we tend to use that term loosely commonly. And as you've already heard, even those actions that are technically in contravention of established rules still may be in close coordination with relevant authorities, like getting permits for marches and things like that. But we'll focus for now on the latter end of the spectrum of those that are designed to undercut rules by flouting them. So we have all sorts of famous examples of this. So for instance, students who sat in at segregated lunch counters in the Jim Crow South in the US were purposefully violating rules and norms, because sometimes these aren't legal rules so much as social norms, that they deemed unjust, to press their case for overturning those rules and revising those norms. Just as important to understanding that tactic as its disobedience, per the terms of the prevailing regime, is the fact, though, that such protest, as we've already heard, is civil, that it's nonviolent. That civility is what gives civil disobedience moral authority and legitimacy, and the added clout. We sometimes hear in the literature of what's termed political jujitsu, or using the power of one's opponents against them, when the response to nonviolent civil protest is aggressive or violent. It helps to highlight and magnify the moral import of the civil nonviolent protest in the first place. While what counts as civil is fairly consistent, what constitutes disobedience, though, varies by place, time, and even community. So we take for granted freedoms of speech, assembly, and so forth in the US, all of those nice things in the Bill of Rights, but elsewhere to speak out is itself disobedience. To exercise voice in any form may be disobedient. And that's not just in full-on authoritarian states. So for instance, Singapore, one of the places in which I work, is not it's electoral authoritarian in the terms of the literature, but elections are held, the regime is highly legitimate, people vote for it willingly. There are limitations, but it's not a liberal democracy, but nor is it a full autocracy. But Singapore has prosecuted the perpetrator of a one-person protest, for instance, for holding up a small sign near the courthouse in violation of constraints on freedom of expression. But what's allowable varies within countries as well. So campuses, we've already heard a bit of this, but campuses are special places with often greater scope for speech, to access books or other materials that may be banned in other contexts, and to associate and express ideas. So norms of academic freedom and university autonomy are in play, but also understandings which may not resonate so much in a context like the US, but certainly if you think of other places with a less highly developed higher education system, or just earlier points in time in the US or elsewhere. But there are understandings of students as being future leaders, as being unself-interested proponents of the public good, and as being idealistic. So especially in earlier days of university development, when graduates were an elite few who really were likely to be the future leaders of government, of society, and of the economy. And across communities, we also may see differences. So what some members of society do freely invite sanctions for others, especially those from marginalized or heavily surveilled minorities. And that applies regardless of country. So inasmuch as activism is disobedient, that it violates the rules to make a point, it runs the risk of penalty, even if it's civil, as Prof. Ingram has already explained. Again, the term tends to be employed more widely, and especially in the US, most activism goes off without a hitch, whether or not it yields results. We see marches, we see protests, we see occupation style protests at all sorts of times and places. The challenge in violating a rule so as to make the point that the rule is unjust or inappropriate is that so long as it is still the rule, violating it may incur penalties. So this raises this rational actor or collective action problem, that those who engage in protest aim to secure a public good, a change to the status quo that will benefit the many. But repeal of an unjust law is a public good, but only those activists who engage in civil disobedience or non-civil disobedience as well bear the potential costs. So this is part of why this is a perennial question for those of us who study activism, or what's broadly termed contentious politics. So similarly, one might engage in civil disobedience to draw attention to an issue other than the rules that that protest breaks. So for instance, one might occupy space without permission or contra prohibitions to attract attention to another cause. So an encampment on a campus, for instance, may not be about protesting a rule against encampments, but rather about promoting divestment or some other desired goal. Not only, though, is that same rational actor problem still in play, there's an incentive to free ride and let others bear the cost of securing the public good, but there's then a really clear challenge of ensuring that the link between protest and object is clear. What specifically the act of civil disobedience hopes to achieve and from whom. So this is a key difference from, for instance, sitting in at a lunch counter to protest segregation and refusal to serve some of those who might sit at that lunch counter and demand service. There, what's being violated is the rule that activists hope to overturn. If there's an encampment about getting universities to divest from Gaza, how to communicate that goal through the act of encampment is a much more challenging dilemma. And that consideration brings us to the implications of this sort of activism. So too often, protest tactics leave too unclear the connection between the strategy adopted, the sort of action taken or the tactic, and the object of protest. What action activists seek to compel from whom? So the implication could be bearing the risk of penalties without payoff. Yet civil disobedience can also succeed, either immediately with a policy change or incrementally, including by undercutting the legitimacy of relevant authorities if they overreact or seem to have done so, again, that political jujitsu, or if protest succeeds in shifting popular opinion or preferences on an issue. And again, that still means that those walking past an encampment must understand what it is there for. What's the cause for which those individuals are sitting in that context? And of course, civil disobedience or protest of any type may reshape social hierarchies or empower new social actors or disempower social actors. So activism may have a net positive effect in expanding rights, but someone may lose out or fear they will, which may lead itself to counter-mobilization. That can also be when we have, as Prof. Ingram already mentioned, in some cases, counter movements that or sort of side efforts that introduce violence, which may be for the same goal, or maybe for the goal of undercutting the initial mobilization. So it all is to say that in understanding why activists adopt a strategy of civil disobedience, there may not be another channel available. So we often hear of this in terms of institutional or non-institutional politics. So this would be non-institutional politics. It's all part of politics. Politics doesn't stop at the ballot box. So everyone should definitely vote who's eligible to vote next week, or I mean, the week after, or early vote. But anyway, this is all part of what one may do when those sorts of institutional channels, lobbying a member of Congress, voting, running for office oneself, those sorts of things might not be available. There might not be a clear channel for expression, or you may fear that that's simply not going to work. So then one adopts civil disobedience, but it's still necessary to consider just as carefully all of these other considerations of how do we make sure that the object and the claim are linked to the strategy, who should bear the risks, what risk are those involved willing to bear, and what are the full range of tactics that might be available that might help to accomplish the same goal and spread out the constituency of who's actually engaging. And I'll stop there now that I see questions are coming in.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Ingram, Dr. Weiss. So I'll read the first question here. It's from Michael Tobman. He asks, has social media and digital connections made protests too easy? Protests used to require infrastructure building, which implied electoral and organizational strength. Has it become too easy to protest, or do the consequences keep it as relevant?
I can take an initial stab at that. So I think part of the question there is social media may make it easier to mobilize in some ways, but that doesn't mean that a diffuse social media protest is going to have the same impact. So we do find cases in which engagement over social media has strong impact, but more often, especially looking sort of globally in a broad context, what that does is it serves as a tactic for getting people out to mobilize on the ground. So it serves as a different form of infrastructure rather than formal, like brick and mortar institutions. There still generally will be institutional forms, social movement organizations that help to channel those actions to craft what we term collective action frames, or ways to understand and language to use to describe what's happening. And so it's not that one becomes unnecessary, that we no longer need or have organizations and structures because there's social media. But social media is, we can see in this way, as in many cases being the latest stage of, in the Philippines, people power and beyond. For instance, we saw text messages and fax machines before that and so forth as being tactics for getting information out. There are some exceptions. There's some really interesting work on Hong Kong, for instance, coming out or recently about the ways in which the complete crackdown on closing political space for protest of other forms has made digital platforms unusually necessary and effective. But where there still is some physical space for protest, the fact of social media doesn't foreclose using that.
Yeah, I would just add a couple thoughts there. I see sort of the point of the question, that maybe physical organizations or infrastructures might have more of an immediate presence, especially if there's a local issue. But the conduits by which organizations can mobilize is an important limiting factor. These mobilizing structures, and to the extent that social media acts as a network, then that can facilitate, right, or create some more flexible opportunities for mobilizing. And if that is done well, then it might work well. It can connect people who are not necessarily geographically proximate. They're not geographically close together, but they share a common perspective, right? Or a common, they share a common position, an ideational position, right? An opinion about something. So it can bring people together in that way who might otherwise never encounter each other. So from the perspective of networks, of social networks, and the extent that facilitates connections among people who might not be physically close to each other, I can see them benefiting each other, or benefiting the mobilization effort.
Great. It's a super interesting question. So again, I'll just reiterate that we encourage people viewing right now to put their questions in the chat or use the hand raise function. While we wait for some questions, I'll ask one very briefly here. So far we've talked a lot about civil disobedience and activism from the perspective of those doing the civil disobedience and the activism. From the other side of this, from the perspective of governments, universities, what are some effective containment or mitigation strategies used? Conversely, what are ways that this can go terribly wrong from the government and university perspective, or any other actor cracking down on trying to constrain protests?
Sorry, Connor, could you repeat the first part? It's when governments or institutions are trying to respond, constrain
Yeah.
expression, how could that go wrong?
Well, what are strategies that successful governments or universities use to contain civil disobedience or mitigate the effects of civil disobedience for making changes in the system? I'm assuming they don't want those changes to occur. And then, yeah, also what are unsuccessful versions of this happening?
So again, I'll start a response, and we'll try to clear away also that Prof. Ingram can fill in some of the gaps here. But so from my perspective, looking at this just as somebody who studies activism and political space broadly, if we see civil disobedience as one way of occupying or using political space and different parts of political space being the full terrain, online and offline now, in which we have engagement with questions of politics, of distribution and so forth, empowerment. One way that relevant authorities can make civil disobedience per se, which carries risks, seem less relatively attractive as a tactic within a tactical repertoire of the choices activists make of how to engage, is by opening up non-disobedient channels. In other words, opening up meaningful and realistically impactful channels for access, so that those who have a cause they hope to promote see a way to do so through institutional rather than non-institutional channels. And so that would be a really simple strategy. The problem is that if these are changes or if these are causes that the relevant authorities really are unlikely to want to support, then those channels are unlikely to be successful. That may mean that civil disobedience is equally unlikely to be successful. The goal is, just if the relevant authorities, be they campus or national or state, see civil disobedience as merely threatening or intimidating or blackmailing or whatever else, they may not respond terribly well. But a first step, if the goal is to avoid that sort of high profile, high pressure tactic, is to have meaningful strategies for communication and consultation along the way. That would be one way to answer.
Yeah, I would second that, again, in the spirit of, in this regard, free speech and democracy exist in a kind of uneasy tension, right? In the sense that we're assuming that there are at least two different positions, and they are trying to convince or persuade each other. And we ideally would like that to take place through words, right? And yet, what happens when words fail? So one thing that, going back to your question, Connor, one thing that institutions could do to prevent that, to prevent words from failing, is to really engage in that process of persuasion, right? And conversation and discussion that Professor Weiss was talking about. Suppose what can go wrong is again when that process of communication fails, and there's all sorts of reasons why that might fail. Or it might fail after a first, initial effort at civil disobedience that is relatively mild, and the parties still don't come to the table. But I think it's also important to remember, I was thinking about the first question that we were addressing, is that it can sometimes be easy to idealize activism as going only in one direction, right? Maybe depending on your viewpoint, that maybe all activism is progressive, right? But there's the activism comes in all shapes and sizes and contents and messages, and it might vary depending on the salience of a particular topic. Some issues are more salient than others. Some issues are less open to compromise. And some positions are it's easier, or it's just the opposing positions that parties take are much starker and inflexible. And I suppose recognizing the varying types of issues might also be one way that containing contention, right, can go wrong, as if there's a failure to recognize maybe what has taken place before, how communication has failed before, and what kind of issue this is, right? How salient is it? But with regards to the first question in social media, I was thinking of some examples where mobilization has gone horribly wrong, right? Through, say, WhatsApp or Facebook, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, but also in Latin America. Right? There's a lot of political violence that has been organized through social media. So it's not all rainbows and unicorns, right? That get mobilized or organized.
Cool. Thanks for answering my question, both of you. So our next question is from Renee. She writes, during the last Lunch and Learn, we talked about whether or not facts matter anymore, especially in political discourse. When thinking about free speech, do facts matter? Or in other words, what are the implications of exercising free speech to spread untruths?
Matt, do you want to start?
And I'm still thinking through it. I was hoping to take the pressure off of you from starting again for a third time in a row. I mean, I think this relates to the discussion about misinformation, disinformation, whether truth with a capital T exists out there anymore. So, and it also speaks to the role of ideology. And Professor Weiss can say a lot more about this, but the sort of classic framework for thinking about mobilization is that it involves both opportunities, right, sort of openings that can come in different shapes and sizes, political openings, economic openings, institutional openings, but also involve mobilizing structures, right, the kinds of things like social media, networks, relationships, and then these cultural ideational frames, right, it's the sort of mental side of mobilization. Some ideas might spread faster than others, or some ideas might open spaces for different kinds of mobilization. And here, ideology matters a lot, right? What you're if depending on how an ideology is not a categorical phenomenon, right? It exists on a spectrum, and if two parties on opposing sides of that spectrum encounter each other, they might not be able to reconcile what is or is not objective reality, right? Just because of the cultural or ideational frame through which they are seeing what's going on. Just turn it over to Professor Weiss.
No, I'll take that as a setup and suggest this may pull me a little bit away from the question, but this what Prof. Ingram just mentioned about the role of ideas and ideology and framing in mobilization offers a different way to look at this question, which is that if, for instance, activists have a cause they want to pursue and they see the moment is right. They have what Doug McAdam calls cognitive liberation, or what we more broadly talk about in terms of political opportunity structures. There's an election coming, so it seems like this is a good moment to try to press the case for some cause. That perception is not objective fact, it's subjectively interpreted. And so that subjective interpretation is what we term a frame, which is, or the longer way of saying that is an ideological or an interpretive framework. And so that doesn't mean that there are no facts and facts don't matter. I'll just say that I'm on the side of, there are facts, there are observable things in the world that we know to be true, and we should believe those things. I like facts. But when we're talking about things like mobilization, what might inspire somebody to mobilize is that they don't just see those facts, but they understand them in a particular way. When we talk about framing, we think about diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational framing, not to get too jargonistic about this, but what is the problem? What might we do about the problem? And why should you get involved in doing something about that problem? And in that vein, activists themselves, these political entrepreneurs is the other jargony term that's used, will explain those facts in a way that will suggest a solution. If the issue is Israeli bombing of Gaza, they will say that, okay, we know this to be happening. No one's debating whether it is happening, it is. But how should one understand that? Should we understand that in terms of self-defense, or should we understand this offensively? What are the terms that we might apply to this? Should we use terms like genocide? Should we use terms like defense? And then once that frame, which is ideologically charged, so an ideology is just a way of perceiving the world and making sense of the world around one. It may be more or less watertight. It may, as you've already heard, be something on a spectrum rather than just a categorical, I am or I am not a holder of this ideological position. But once you have that diagnosis, this is how we should understand the problem. What then is the proposed solution? All of this is a question of language. It's all about words. And so therefore, when we talk about speech, we should be thinking about these frames as well. If there's a prognosis, the prognosis is that activists should pressure the US government to divest from blah, 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 or should pressure a university to divest, presumably making a link of how divestment would, from where, toward what end, how publicly, would somehow change that diagnosed problem. Okay, there's bombing going on. How does divestment from a university perspective help to change that? And then the motivational piece. Why should individual students or other activists get involved? So all of that has to do with the ways in which we may have really divergent words, different language, but that's a kind of legitimate difference in framing as opposed to necessarily seeing reality in different terms, which would be more problematic.
Just as Professor Weiss was talking there, I was thinking of how this relates back to the campus environment, because you can think of everything that we've talked about with regards to free speech and whether or not it's disruptive, that speaking untruths, especially if it's done in a kind of persistent, extreme form, might be disruptive to the educational mission of a classroom or course of study, or if it's pervasive enough to the university as a whole. So we could imagine situations where it might be in the interest of a particular faculty member, a professor, or in the administration of perhaps um, restricting those activities if they're sufficiently disruptive, right? So I'm thinking maybe even in a specific classroom, if there were an individual that were insistent every time the class met about bringing up the same topic that was factually untrue or that involved misinformation or disinformation, and it kept persisting time after time after time to the point that it was derailing the activities of the course, then it ties very nicely back into what we were talking about early with regards to free speech on campus.
All right, so I'm just looking through the participants. It doesn't look like there are any hands raised. We still have 20 minutes, so it looks like yes, we still have 20 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, we really encourage you to put them in the chat. For the time being, I have a question of, and this may very well differ along cultural or regional lines here, but are there any constant demographic characteristics or frequent demographic characteristics that attend civil disobedience? I often think of young people. We've been talking about student-led protests, but are there common economic conditions or economic classes civil disobedience and political movements will come from, or racial or ethnic or anything along those lines?
I mean, oh, sorry, did you want to start?
No, I think this is your wheelhouse.
Okay. So there aren't overall sort of common demographic or other characteristics, but we can think about these in structural terms in terms of who might engage in civil disobedience versus some other way of exercising voice and influencing political outcomes. So those who have structural access to the polity may be less likely to engage in civil disobedience if they have a more direct means of access to be heard and have confidence that they will be heard and heeded through institutional channels. So for instance, one key way of thinking about this is there's work on what's termed state feminism, which is when governments have like a ministry for women's affairs, which is an institutional access point for feminist activists, for instance, to say, look, we want equal pay legislation, rather than engaging in civil disobedience in, occupying some space or staging marches or whatever else. They may be able to go to a minister or secretary for women's affairs and say, hey, here are our data. Rather than shouting in the street, we're going to bring it directly to the policymaker and see if that works. If that doesn't work, then they may still feel structurally marginalized, or they may feel shut out of the debate. That said, we do have a subset of what some sociologists term marginal elites, which would be groups like students, clergy, military, who tend to be in sequestered locations like a campus or military base or monastery, who tend to have a particular status vis-a-vis society, who are in kind of communities where they speak with others within their group, probably more than with outsiders. In other words, you can sort of see how there's a parallel among those. They may have also specific governing authorities that are applicable only to their space and not more broadly. So, military leadership and military tribunals as opposed to the broader social ones, a religious hierarchy, a campus hierarchy. So if students protest, for instance, their first level of authority to which they answer is not generally a state or local government, but a campus president or a provost or other campus officials, including campus police, as opposed to a general city police force. And so that tends to give those communities particular moral standing or sense of entitlement to speak out, especially on certain issues. So if there are issues related to religious affairs, and maybe that those who are within those marginal elites, those sequestered religious communities, may feel that we've got this area covered. By the same token, we may find that those who are in professional associations feel both pressured and entitled to take a stand on issues related to their specific area. And so we find versions of that also with maybe an issue related to race. That might be those who are disprivileged in racial terms who feel more entitled and perhaps pressed to speak, but they don't have that same agglomeration generally within particular institutional contexts. So there may be urban areas, for instance, that have, a large Arab American population in Detroit, for instance. So you might expect to hear pushback on some areas of US policy related to Muslim states in those cities that have a large community. But that's still different from having the concentration of people within a sequestered environment, which privileges their identity as having particular right to voice. So those are some of the reasons why we do see student protest as a phenomenon. It's that you have students who are in a place. There are these really interesting studies of campus ecology, of the actual layout, such that you see people who are protesting and you walk down from your dorm and you go join them, or you see, these particular areas where you have signs advertising protests that everybody walks past every day, or, these other ways that facilitate mobilization. So that may help those particular sequestered, organized, sort of concentrated groups to develop an identity as having particular voice, which in the case of students more than other groups, maybe for issues that are not related to their own status. So students who speak out on questions of labor when they're not themselves workers, or on questions of foreign policy when they're not involved with the relevant, national or other communities. And that has to do with sort of a symbolic loading of students as having, as I mentioned before, this sort of unself-interested, idealistic drive to engage with a society of which they're destined to become leaders. So I've said enough on that, I think. But if you want to add anything, go for it.
No, I don't have anything to add. I was looking at one of the other questions that's coming in.
All right. Yeah. Wow. That was extremely informative, Dr. Weiss. Thank you. Yeah. So we have a question from James Acker. Seems like pretty in Dr. Ingram's wheelhouse here. Federal law guarantees freedom from a hostile educational environment. The First Amendment, however, guarantees robust free speech. How might these principles best be reconciled when in tension?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Professor Acker. The question speaks to a training that the university is actually requiring about Title VI and anti-discrimination. Title VI was part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and so it protects against discrimination. And at the same time, we have freedoms of speech, right, or protections against impingements or restrictions on speech. And so we can imagine situations where those two things might be in tension with each other, right? That you can say or write any message you want, right? And that at the same time that what one person says might be considered hostile or discriminatory by another person. And we've seen that manifest itself, right, with the Israel-Gaza conflict on campus. And then what one group might express in favor of Israel is experienced as hostility by another group who might be supporting Gaza or the Palestinian experience. And so where to draw the line, right? They exist in tension with each other. And this is an uneasy relationship. Okay? And there are no clear black and white solutions, but we go back to some of the same principles that we were talking about earlier, that unless the speech is threatening or inciting others to violence or disruptive, right? We can imagine this kind of speech coming up in a classroom where if the statements or the expressions are vehement enough, right, that it could create an environment of hostility in the classroom that is not advancing the educational purpose of that designated forum, right, or the purpose for that classroom meeting. So this is an uneasy relationship, right? But that's part of living in a democracy, is being willing to let people say things even if you disagree with the things that they are saying, as long as they stay within certain boundaries. And so from my own personal perspective, I would prefer that the things people say and express are more inclusive, right, in nature. But just because somebody says something exclusive or that I disagree with them, does not mean that I would want them removed from the democratic community. I mean, I'm verging towards veering into personal perspective, so I'll rein myself back in. But returning to our general principles that we were talking about, we can imagine situations where discriminatory speech is okay by free speech, and yet creates other challenges under Title VI. And we want to be mindful of those challenges, especially on a campus and especially on a public university campus.
Do you want to add anything to that, Dr. Weiss, or should we go to the next one? All right. All right, so we have a question in the chat from Michael Tobman. He asks, what would constitute uncivil protest? Mentions a couple examples here: IRA, the Inkatha Freedom Party, the ANC, was Viet Cong non-civil than the state. What's at the other end of what we're discussing?
So I can address that first. So there's not a clear demarcation between civil and uncivil, but there's a whole literature on what we term civil society, which is, broadly speaking, the area, the broad political space between the family, so not just your own personal home life, and the state. And you'll often separate out economic society, businesses, from that. But that's a really capacious space. And within that space, you'll have actors who may engage using civil tactics and non-civil. The term that's increasingly used is uncivil society for those who are using violent tactics. But one may make the case, and co-authors and I have made the case, that we need to see this as part of that same broad political space, that we should consider civil society and uncivil society in tandem. That said, one caveat I'll give about the way that Michael Tubman has framed this question is where political parties fit is unclear. So Gramsci, going back to the early literature, considers political parties part of civil society. They're increasingly now considered to be really part of the state, or as wanting to be in the state. My own take is that political parties may be part of the state, but there's less in the US than in other places where parties function differently within society. There may be parts of the party organizational structure that are really essentially civil society. We have parties that have local branch organizations, buildings where people can go across local communities, for instance. They may not be in government, so they're not part of the state, but they may function as social movement organizations, essentially. So that's sort of a side issue, but it helps to situate how should we understand something like the ANC, which became a governing party, but for most of its earlier life was not. That said, the division between, part of why it's maybe useful to think of civil and uncivil in tandem, is that most of these sorts of groups tend to move between these tactics. So we think of organizations as having a tactical repertoire, a bunch of different strategies they may deploy at different times, given political opportunity structures, given collective action frames, given the threats and that they perceive. And when we talk about political opportunities or openings, we should also think about perception of threats, given provocation. So it's very difficult to maintain this sort of a Gandhian strategy of nonviolence, for instance, includes a strict admonition that if you're attacked, you need not to strike back. That may be hard to sustain. So there may be those who are nonviolent just as a tactical choice, but not in that same ideological frame, that once they're hit, they'll hit back, right? But there may be also groups that feel at times that they have institutional access and then lose that and see no other choice, no other tools left in their tactical toolbox, in their repertoire beyond violent tactics. And so those are groups, and I'm not saying that this is a just thing or a moral thing or anything else, it's a factual matter, that may then shift towards strategies of violence. And so that would be what we would consider to be uncivil protest. It's violent protest. And it does happen. Those same groups may shift back to nonviolent means over time, or in different contexts or with different questions. So it's important in that sense, my larger point, to separate the tactic and and to think through the choices behind that strategy, which is high risk, which morally delegitimates in a way that nonviolent or civil protest doesn't. And that may be an act of desperation more than an act of free choice. but may also itself be chosen for the specific type of impact it gives, or because of an alignment between an act of violence with the specific goals sought. So for instance, for the Viet Cong, which is a military wing of a political party, which at the time claimed that state. This was after the 1954 Geneva Accords. The Communist Party and the Viet Cong, they claimed that state. That claim wasn't recognized internationally, and so those strategies may be in line with the specific object, the tactic and the object, the framing and the object, all of those aligning. But more generally, when we're talking about civil disobedience and using violence so it's uncivil disobedience, we need to think through why was that tactic chosen instead of others? What does that incivility aim to convey, and what sort of greater risks it entails? That doesn't mean that it's legitimate. It doesn't mean that states or other relevant authorities should simply sit back and say, well, that was a fair choice. But that is part of the tactical toolbox.
Go for it.
No, I was just going to say that was a great answer, and I see that Michael Tobin liked the answer as well. Fantastic, comprehensive response.
All right, awesome. It looks like we probably only have time for one question here, so my apologies to Dr. Briner. I don't know if we'll be able to fit it in, but first we'll read Renee's question here. She writes, thinking about what you said about idealizing activism and that many times there are not legal consequences for civil disobedience, do authorities have an obligation to respond to activism that seeks to disrupt our political, legal, educational systems in a serious negative way?
Yeah, maybe I can start there. Just going back to how we might define or conceptualize civil disobedience. It is in this kind of textbook way, it is the deliberate breaking of law, or that disobedience that Professor Weiss was talking about, and also in a civil way, in that way that Professor Weiss was talking about. So it's nonviolent, but it's also one of the other attributes that's often tied to civil obedience, is that the goal is not to upend the entire system, right? And even just speaking to the legal system, it's about breaking deliberately one law, right, in a highly strategic fashion without upending the legal system. Now, in practice, the tactics might not align with that prototypical form of civil disobedience. But I did want to distinguish between civil disobedience, the way we've been talking about it, and an activism that might be much more disruptive in a kind of systemic fashion. But then also speaking to the second part of that question about what obligation do authorities have, and that in practice, maybe people who engage in civil disobedience, at least in the United States or in these campus events that we've been seeing, don't have any consequences. It's something to consider, right? That an arrest, there's a willingness, or at least an awareness, that there could be consequences, and that might come in the form of an arrest. But police might be following the letter of the law, right, in a very kind of black and white fashion, or they might also be following the spirit of the law, and especially if they're working in coordination with the activists themselves, right? As we have been talking about, occurred in many cases, that the civil disobedience is choreographed. It's highly organized in coordination with authorities. Then there would be little incentive to drop the hammer, right, on those activists. And it might not be their decision to do that. The police might detain and then release some of the participants, but even if they're detained and arrested, it's not their decision to then charge or prosecute, right? That would be a prosecutor's decision, and there might be other incentives at work there, since the prosecutors are elected, and they might be responding to constituencies that are far beyond the local authorities that responded to the incident.
I'm going to jump in and I'll bring in Professor Briner's question a little bit. So he asks about whether a challenge to authority and control authorities may label that as uncivil despite rights of free speech. And I think that's an important way to bring back both what Prof. Ingram has just said and the sort of overarching framework here. That is not uncivil. It's important that when we think about the legal context as well as the moral or normative context, to make that distinction between what is civil and uncivil, which is just another way in our, it's a coding for saying violent or non-violent, violent being uncivil, non-violent civil, versus disobedient or obedient. Disobedient versus obedient means inside or outside established institutional rules and laws. And again, social norms may play a role here too. So to say that something is challenging of authority and control, if it's not uncivil, it may be disobedient, but it's still civil disobedience. Where that challenge to authority is, setting fire to a building, or attacking a campus, police official, or attacking other students, or especially in a context where hate speech is criminalized. Yes, that's breaking a law, but it's also, that would be uncivil. I think most of us would agree. There may be some that might have some room for negotiation. Again, I'm not a lawyer. So, but at the same time, if it's civil but disobedient, it's civil disobedience. And it doesn't matter if it's challenging to authority. That's the whole nature of protest. And so challenging authority isn't in and of itself inappropriate or undemocratic. It's the modes taken that operate within an inclusive spirit of participation, engagement, voice, and so forth. That's still civil and legitimate in that sense, but it's just an important distinction to maintain.
All right, thanks for threading together that last question there, Dr. Weiss. So it looks like we're out of time here. Thank you, Dr. Weiss. Thank you, Dr. Ingram. And thank you, everybody who contributed to our discussion today. It was a blast. You can join us on Monday for the next edition of the Rockefeller College Election Series. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence, its effects on politics, society, and public policy. So join us then Monday, 12 to 1 on Zoom. Thanks, everyone.